You're about to meet the innovators and influencers who are restoring the judeo-christian foundations of our culture right here on The Patrick Coffin Show.
And now, here's your host, Patrick Coffin.
This is The Patrick Coffin Show. Phil Cooke joins us from beautiful downtown Burbank, California. Phil Cooke, it's an honor to have you, sir.
Hey, I'm thrilled to be here. This is always fun with you.
Can I start with Billy Graham?
Absolutely.
I've read through. By the way, I'm going to be doing this without any shame at all. I want to throw hearts, minds, and earballs and eyeballs to your book, The Last TV Evangelist: Why the Next Generation Couldn't Care Less About Religious Media and Why It Matters. Hilarious, insightful. One thing I love about this book is your devotion to following up with good footnotes. There's lots of additional stuff that you pack into this book. And I know that you have worked with Reverend Graham. Growing up in Canada with a very Protestant set of... I had a great aunt and her longtime spinster roommate were very solid Christian Protestant women. And they were like two grandmothers I never had. And they always had Billy Graham on in the background. I loved his crusades. I just loved his humility. So Billy Graham's appearance in, I want to say 1962 on the Jack Parr Show, really got my attention because I interview people for a living. I love watching the great masters of interview technique. Of course, the greats didn't make it look like an interview at all. And Jack Parr is kind of the king of that. But Billy Graham was on the show, I want to say, I know he was on several times. But in this particular episode, Jack Parr wants to talk about his crusades and his books and all that. And Reverend Graham kept gently bringing his appearance on the show back to Jack Parr and asking Jack if he'd been to church. And his references to Christ were very natural. And to me, this is a great before-after photo of where we are in our culture. First of all, you're probably not going to have the producer of Jimmy Kimmel invite Rick Warren on, or any of the top name communicators. So there was a mutual openness to a conversation, between the two worldviews that this sort of vanished today. Do you know the episode I'm talking about?
Absolutely. And as you talk about that, I was thinking about guys like Fulton Sheen, Oral Roberts, along with Billy, guys who were doing primetime television back in those days and had a huge, huge audience. I mean, remember, those were in the 3-channel TV channel days. So it was a huge audience and they could relate to regular people. And it was very Oral, when Oral did big primetime TV specials, he had Johnny Cash on, he had Robert Goulet on, he had all kinds of people on from all walks of life. And that is something we miss today. We don't have much of a bridge between the sacred and the secular world when it comes to media. And I think we're much, we suffer for that. I miss that quite a bit.
Yeah, I remember when you pretty much had Walter Cronkite, a younger Dan Rather, and so very narrow gatekeeper or gatekeepers, and they were the only filters. And so the upside of that was massive audience. Just 10 minutes ago, prepping for our conversation, Phil, I read in a book on the history of the Dumont radio network that Bishop Sheen on a typical night had 10 million viewers on Life is Worth Living. This is the late 50s. People would kill for that kind of audience leveraging.
I was thinking a few years ago, remember the last episode of the Seinfeld show? Yes. They made a big deal about how huge that audience was. Well, I went back and checked, and for a regular weekly Sunday morning episode of Oral Roberts' program, he had more viewers than many more viewers, by the way, than the final episode of Seinfeld. So a 3-channel world was huge, and when cable splintered the channels into, I think I have DirecTV now with about 500 channels. Now, suddenly the audience is so splintered up, it's just hard to find that giant aggregate audience that we used to have back then. It was an interesting time, there's no question. Was
Oral Roberts the first televangelist, so to speak, to leverage what we would now look back and call paid advertising, where he would actually fundraise so that he could get on secular platforms and have on A-list performers? Obviously, they're feeding his Christian message, but they were happy to come on because they were often believers themselves. Just talk about the willingness to go onto a platform that's not owned and run by Christians.
Well, back in the 40s, Oral was having giant tent crusades, much like Billy did a little bit later. And Oral was getting as many as 10,000 people in a tent, because back in those days, there weren't many buildings in America that could handle crowds like that. And somebody went to him and said, look, if you're getting this kind of an audience, you should think about television. So Oral actually came to NBC, which used to be here in Burbank, and he came out and visited with NBC, and they said, great, we'll get Gillette, we'll get Bayer, we'll get Holiday Inn, we'll get some corporate sponsor to sponsor the program. Mm-hmm. Well, in those days, people don't realize today that back in those days, the sponsors had a huge, huge impact on the show. They could pick the director. They could approve the content. And Oral thought, I can't have a guy from Gillette Razor tell me what I can preach on and what I can't. Yeah. So he turned NBC down, went back to Tulsa, and then the thought occurred to him, what if I raised the money and paid for it? And so that really began what we call today as paid time broadcasting. And most Christian broadcasting is exactly that model. They go to a network or a TV station or radio station in some cases, and they actually pay for the time slot to be on. And it's got its ups and downs. It's got its pluses and minuses. But back in those days, it set the model for vast, vast audiences to watch Christian programming. And you're right. And they had secular stars, but many of them, many of those stars actually were Christians or at least sympathetic to the cause. And he'd have Robert Goulet sing "Oh Holy Night," and he'd have country stars, and Jerry Lewis was a comedian that was on. And so big stars would attract big audiences, and then they could hear Oral's message. And Billy was the same way when he would do his primetime specials. And Fulton Sheen had a great strategy for being on television. So those guys, I envy those guys. They were original thinkers. They were very creative. They were completely out of the box for their time. Yeah. And I think we miss those guys that are trying to bridge those worlds today. We just don't see that very much.
Yeah, each of them in their own way started trends. They didn't follow them.
That's exactly right. Exactly. Well, think of Robert Schuller started a drive-in church. People can actually drive in their car and put the microphone on the lip of their window and listen to him preach because they had to get to the beach. And so it's very impressive how different leaders in different times have creatively tried to solve the solution of how do we reach more people with the message.
Out here in Southern California, what was once called the Crystal Cathedral, it's now called Christ Cathedral. It's owned by the Catholic Diocese here.
Catholic Church has it now, right?
It does, and they're doing a big renovation, and it still looks a bit Star Trek setty, but it has bigness and unusuality. Is that a word? I just coined a word. Unusuality
works for me.
As a virtue. But Bishop Sheen was given a wide open door and red carpet treatment by Reverend Schuller. In his declining years, Bishop Sheen could barely find a Catholic audience to step in front of because a whole generation identified him with that sort of dated 50s era, a little more dramatic than the cool 70s were setting in. Yes. And so he preached there 4 or 5 times in the 70s before his 1979 death. So it's another interesting ally relationship.
It really was. And they just were so good about crossing those bridges. I think they respected the doctrinal differences, which I think are, significant. They're important. However, they understood that grace, love, that brings people together. And you're not going to convince anybody of your point if you're arguing with them or going to be critical. And I think that's a big problem with the way we engage the culture today as Christians. We've tried to boycott everybody. We've tried to petition Hollywood. We don't like that certain businesses say Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas. So we launch an online petition drive. Yeah. But the truth is, if boycotts and petitions and criticism worked, why don't missionaries do it? Let's send missionaries to third world countries, surround a village, and criticize them. That's going to win them to the Lord. That just doesn't work for missionaries. So it's not going to work in Hollywood or with the gay community or anybody else. So I think how we engage the culture, there's something we could learn from those guys of that earlier generation.
I got an nasty email from someone who I know it's shocking. This guy took serious umbrage with my support of Darren Aronofsky's movie Noah.
Oh boy!
Now Noah definitely colors outside the creative lines, but he's got a couple paragraphs to work with. You know what I mean?
Right, exactly.
With Genesis, and he was actually trying to raise money to do a counter documentary criticizing Christians who supported Noah.
Wow.
With limited number of hours per day, it just struck me as just bizarre.
Well, your critics are going to have to get in line behind my critics. When I wrote my blog post about it, I got the most responses I've ever gotten to a blog post. And it was just really remarkable. But my response is, first of all, I wrote a post saying that this is a perfect time to take a non-believing friend to see a movie. How easy is that? And then after it's over, take them to a coffee shop or a restaurant or someplace and tell them the real story. It's a great opportunity for evangelism. But man, one guy one of my critics was creative. He said, "I hope you enjoy your 30 pieces of silver."
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, I was called the spawn of Satan. But two things I think are important here. One is I talked to the American Bible Society, the YouVersion Bible app, which is the most popular online Bible app, as well as Bible Gateway, another online Bible site. Mm-hmm. All three of them said in the first 4 days that movie was released, the Noah story, reading the Noah story spiked. I mean, by huge margins across the country. American Bible Society reported that in their office on Manhattan in New York City, people would come into the office and they'd say, "Tell me more about that Noah story that's out there in that movie form. That's amazing." So even though it was not theologically accurate, it generated a huge amount of interest in the Noah story. And the second thing that I think is important is Paramount Pictures, they were willing to put up $250 million to produce and market the film because they believed in that story. Yeah. I have yet to find the Christian organization that believes in the Noah story so much they're willing to put $250 million up to tell that story to the public. So there's some very positive things we could learn from that, even though, as you're right, he colored way outside the lines from a theological perspective, but it was something worth looking at, I think.
Was that blog post where you said we really need to be heading for the hills now because the end is nigh? Was that it?
Yes,
that was hilarious.
Pretty much.
And I'm sure you had people who didn't quite get the tongue-in-cheek thing.
No, they've tracked me.
I wrote a sarcastic blog post. I just couldn't help myself attacking Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ because the Bible nowhere depicts a bag of coins flying in slow motion. That's Satan didn't have a love child, a chubby, ugly love child. Come on, this is obviously written by the devil.
True. Well, I think we have to give artists a certain license, even when we don't agree.
Sure.
Because there's bigger goals here. There's telling our story, trying to get our story told in the public square is absolutely critical, I think, today more than ever. I mean, I don't think we live in a post-Christian generation. I think we're already full circle to a pre-Christian generation. Nobody knows what the Bible is about or any Christian principles anymore. Yeah. So I think the more opportunities we have to tell that story, even though it's not 100% right, I might side on just getting that story out there.
Do you find, Phil, that the other side, by the other side, I mean, let's say secular folk or lapsed Christians who have low information, they paradoxically, frequently get the story right, more right or more in a way that's more engaging than practicing Christians who we can't help it. We got to have a Jesus figure. We got to have, if not an altar call, then some big, here's the message speech, folks, right?
Yes. Go ahead.
Well, just that I'm thinking of an essay by Tom Parham. Tom Parham wrote, I think it's a book chapter and an essay. It's very readable called "Why Do Heathens Make the Best Christian Films?"
Yes. Well, it's funny. Tom goes to teaches at Azusa Pacific University. Mm-hmm. I was there this morning, actually, speaking to a class, and I used the illustration that the first question I got from college students was, "Why do Christians make such terrible movies?" Mm-hmm. And my response was that we're working so hard to get the message right that we fail to tell a great story. And I think telling the story well is the number one most important priority, because if we don't tell a good story, I don't care how Christian it is, it's going to fail. Nobody's going to watch it. So I think filmmakers could learn a lot from the fact that we have to tell a great story first, then weave the Christian thought, principles, morals, whatever into the story. That's when it connects with audiences and it really makes an impact.
Is part of the crisis among all Christian churches the fact that our ideological opponents are telling our story? They're branding us. So if you do a man on the street in any American city or small town, word association, I'll say a word and you say the first thing that comes to mind, Christian. You're probably going to hear some version of bigot, narrow, anti-science, maybe boring, irrelevant.
Yeah.
They identify the Christian set of lenses with insipid, kind of predictable, instead of, the high adventure of personal holiness, to me, is the most unpredictable of all. You always know what a sinner's going to do. You don't really know what a saint's going to do next. Does that make sense?
That's true. Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that your example of what a non-believer would call a Christian is very similar to what Jesus called the Pharisees back in the New Testament. The whitewashed sepulchers. We look great on the outside, but we're hypocrites on the inside. We don't do what we say we do. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the reason that we've been marginalized in the culture, the reason we're being dismissed, we don't have a place at the table, is simply because we're not living the story out. We are terrible salespeople. The truth is, if we were selling the gospel, if this was a sales issue, mm-hmm. think of the things that would be on the side of the box. Eternal life, unbelievable forgiveness, grace, a second chance. It would be a wonderful product. But we're not selling that product very well. We're not sharing that story very well. And I think non-believers look at the lives we live. I mean, here's my big thing. How many people that you associate with every day in your office, at work, at school, how many of those know that you're even a believer? Mm-hmm. I mean, if you associate with people every day and they don't even realize you're a Christian, what does that say about the life you're living? I just think we're not good examples of what we're supposed to be doing. There's
a researcher in a Catholic context named Sherry Weddell. I want to say Weddell. She has a book called Forming Intentional Disciples. And she has a great thought experiment. What if your local church, your local parish stopped existing?
Okay.
Would the town notice?
Great question. Yeah.
Are we, really? Pope Francis talks about getting away from the self-referential church. I love that phrase. It just distills so much of our obsession with what our adjective is. Oh, I'm a traditional Christian. I'm progressive. I'm liberal. I'm conservative. Meanwhile, the people in our orbit that we could be reaching out with, let's start with kindness, are missing all of it because we're too addicted to getting our own adjectives right.
Yeah, we've become the God. It's interesting. We just finished producing a feature documentary film called The Insanity of God. It was based on a book by a missionary, Nick Ripken, who was in Somalia. His son died on the field, his 18-year-old son, and it kind of spun him off. And he pulled back and decided, I'm going to travel around the world to see if God shows up in difficult places. Mm-hmm. And we decided to follow him on the trip. We took cameras, and we ended up doing a 90-minute feature documentary that was in theaters nationwide. But the interesting thing about filming it was he was interviewing Chinese house church leaders. And he discovered that although house churches are against, the churches are against the law officially, they're being shut down left and right. He discovered that in many, many communities throughout China, they allow the house churches to go on because of a single reason. They make such a positive impact in the community that the communist leaders just figured, you know what, let's just let these guys do what they do. Mm-hmm. We don't like them. We don't want them here, but they're making such an impact. It's best to let them go. I thought, man, what about churches in the U.S.? Are we making such an impact in our community that even pagans, even raging non-believers would look at our churches and think, that's a good thing that it's here. I don't believe that stuff, but it's a good thing it's here.
I have a lot of Chaldean Christian friends here in Southern California, and they note that Saddam Hussein, dictator though he was, made sure that all his staff that surrounded him were Christians because he knew they weren't going to steal from him. There was a built-in reliability. Okay, I know I don't believe it, but I know what you believe, and you're the people I want in my inner circle.
Wow.
Moving from the shift from the few narrow gatekeepers controlling the message back in the 3 era day. I growing up in Eastern Canada, I remember the day we got cable. It's like, what? 7 stations?
Yeah.
I can still remember the Canadian National Anthem being played like at 1 a.m. after the last hockey game was over. But the downside of this digital revolution where the show begins when you want it to begin and the increased pickiness of the audience and their standard has raised because there's so many choices. Is the downside to that also the upside that now there's so many choices that people are faced with overwhelmed? And you better be good because on this side of the dial and on that side of the dial, there might be something that's shiny or more glittering.
Yeah.
If everybody's Walter Cronkite, then boy, it's hard to make.
Nobody's Walter.
Yeah, right.
Well, when I wrote my book, Unique, I discovered that British researchers have discovered that the average person is hit with about 5,000 media messages every single day. So think of print ads, bus ads, radio ads, internet ads. We're just being bombarded with media messages. Mm-hmm. So in that world, it's not the best message that cuts through. It's the message that knows how to navigate all that clutter. Another interesting thing is about 6 months ago, the Wall Street Journal unveiled a story that said that when you meet someone for the first time, you decide within 4 to 8 seconds what you think of that person. Mm-hmm. Now, you haven't had time to meet them, to talk to them really, but we're being pulled in so many directions that we've adapted culturally by just saying, we're going to make decisions fast. So I meet you for the first time, Patrick. I decide in 4 to 8 seconds what I think of you. And I've discovered it's true of church, it's true of products, it's true of business. I tell pastors and priests and community leaders that, look, I'm glad your sermon, your homily is fantastic. I'm glad your worship is great. But in an 8-second world, what's your lobby look like? What is it like to park to get to your church?
Yep.
What are the things that people encounter, that greeter, that usher, they first meet when they walk in the door? If a visitor walks in and meets a grumpy usher, that's the perception they're going to have for your church. So suddenly the first 8 seconds of any experience becomes incredibly important. And we have to think of that when it comes to the church.
I'm totally stealing that. The grumpy usher.
Yeah, and there's a few out there, trust me.
There are. Oh, yes. You mentioned the word ad and sell earlier. A lot of people watching this and listening to it might object to importing a Madison Avenue secular profit-based thing. Do you think that Christians are wrong to be resistant to using the tools of Madison Avenue to leverage the gospel? Because they know exactly how to implant an idea, how to persuade people. And it's usually, my daughters and I talk about this all the time. We'll analyze a billboard as to why it's effective. Why is it making you ponder or stay more than 3 or 4 seconds? And usually it has to do with something that the person who created it knows I want. Whether it's based on fallen human nature and our desire for affirmation or acceptance or what have you. But I wonder why more churches don't adopt professional tools to draw people in and then, let the gospel out of its cage. Because I'm a big defender of the faith, but the faith in a way just needs to be let out of its cage.
That's right. That's so true. Well, I think there's a couple things to think about. Marketing, for instance, the definition of marketing is just getting your product in front of as many people as possible. That's exactly what we try to do with the gospel. So I don't see a conflict there. Obviously, we have to be careful. We have to be sensitive about settings and audiences and things. But the fact is, I'm reminded that Jesus had 3 years of adult ministry on the earth. I mean, he was God. He knew what window he had. And he probably should have written a book about theology or church leadership or doctrine or some serious things like that. But what did he do? He spent his whole ministry telling stories. He used the Madison Avenue techniques of his time. He told parables, which are simply stories. And the interesting thing to me about Jesus and his stories is he rarely ever explained them. He didn't say, now here's what I mean. He just told the story and walked away. He sometimes told his disciples because they were a little thick sometimes. But Jesus, even the time when he was preaching to people and he ended up getting in a boat and going out a little from shore, he could get better sound bouncing that way. You can talk to more people if you're standing in a boat, bouncing the sound off the water to a big crowd. Jesus was using techniques and ideas of his time to share the message with more and more people. So I think to not do it is to deny. I mean, I look at the culture and I see people going to hell every day. And I think, what could I do better to reach those people? And if that means getting a better microphone, using video, using social media, using some technique online, using radio, I'm on that bandwagon because I think the stakes are too high. And it's time we really got out there and let the gospel be unleashed.
I know you're an avid student of the thought of Marshall McLuhan, my fellow Canadian. There's an interview that his son Eric edited. I've had the privilege of interviewing Eric before. It's called The Medium and the Light, and it's just a great conversation on a topic that McLuhan rarely broached in public, and that was the faith aspect. And he said, riffing off his famous phrase, the medium is the message, he says, in Jesus Christ can it be said that the medium and the message are one?
Wow.
To have seen me is to have seen the Father.
Right.
I've been, by the way, I'm going to the Holy Land next March, and I've been there at the Mount of Beatitudes, and you can hear fishermen singing a mile or two out. It's just like perfect acoustics.
It's amazing.
Here our Lord's using the topography as a kind of a media tool to maximize his message.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think if we just study the life of Christ, we could learn so much about how he engaged people. And here's the other thing. People today criticize large churches because they assume they must be teaching shallow messages. And if a lot of people are coming to hear you, there must be something wrong. Well, the fact is, read the book of Mark over and over and over. It talks about the volume of people that came to hear Jesus' message. There are passages like people couldn't get through town. People couldn't walk. There were so many. Mark uses the word throngs of people. There's something about Jesus that really attracts people. And the fact that a lot of people are coming to hear the message is a wonderful thing. So I think we're shooting each other. We're shooting the wounded. We need to get more unified if we're really going to make an impression and get the gospel story out to this culture that desperately needs it.
One of my mentors is Professor Peter Kraft. I call C.S. Lewis England's Peter Kraft. And he has this great line. My regular viewers will know what I'm about to say. Feuding brothers reconcile when a maniac is at the door.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
You know, we assume that, because church community X has a large throng following the pastor, it must suck. It's a weird conclusion.
I thought this morning I'm going to write a blog post about that issue because I get so frustrated by it. If you go on Instagram, you have all these really hardcore Bible teacher guys constantly talking about big churches. They're totally shallow. They're killing us. It's a shame. Yet, I don't know. I don't see that in the book of Mark. That's for sure. Throngs and throngs of people came to hear the message. And it's time we understood the power of what the gospel message is really all about.
I wonder sometimes which is more powerful as a fear, fear of failure or fear of success with Christians who want to get out there. You know, you look at the culmination of Christ's ministry. It's the biggest failure in the history of the world. He's, betrayed, tortured, murdered. That's it, Lord?
Yes.
Yeah, it's the ultimate failure. The whole faith foundation is based on apparent failure.
It didn't end well for most of those guys.
Yeah, that's right, for the followers too. Phil, is print dead?
Oh, absolutely not. You know, it's interesting. For the last couple of years, I believe that Amazon has reported that ebooks have been outselling print books. But as of a year ago, print books are back into number one. So I'm finding more and more people who have given up their ebook readers and are going back to print. I also think that print is a great tool for getting your message out there. If you're a pastor, a business leader, and you have a message you want to get out of the news media, print is a powerful tool. I write books, and when I write a new book, I'm on the Today Show, I'm on Fast Company and Fox and CNN and magazines and TV. In between books, nobody cares about Phil. So books are a tool for getting journalists to want to talk about your message and gives them a reason to have you on their program. So I think there's a lot of reasons that, and of course, I'm just an obsessive reader anyway, but I think there's a lot of reasons that the technology may change. We may go to ebooks. We may go to a chip that they implant in our brain. I don't know. But I think reading is always going to be around.
Now I know what that funny feeling is. You have implanted a chip in my brain. Wow. Or maybe it's one of my critics mixing me up with you. I don't know.
Could be.
Phil, I could talk your ear off. I appreciate your busy schedule. Thanks for carving out some time with us today on the Patrick Coffin Show.
I'm always challenged when I'm talking to you, so I appreciate it. It's been great fun.
All right. Well, that's faint praise indeed. Get his book, Unique or Jolt, or the one we were talking about earlier, The Last TV Evangelist. Cook Picture is a good spot to subscribe to you and follow you, philcooke.com.
I have a blog at philcooke.com. People can subscribe to that and for free and get my top post every week. And it's kind of the intersection of faith, media, and culture. And so I'd encourage people to go check it out.
Yeah,
Cook with an E, by the way.
Cook with an E. That's funny. That's why I say Phil Cooke with an E. And I'm anti-spam. I'm an anti-spam activist. But I always, when yours arrive, I always open them up first of all. So thanks for being a gift, Phil.
Thank you.
All right. This is the Patrick Coffin Show.